Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session. As you see, I've got invited by PECB to present you for today the topic on GDPR. Let me introduce myself a bit first. As probably some of you have seen, I got some invites on LinkedIn already. I'm working quite a while already on identity and access management, and that's quite an excellent way to get in touch with data protection and of course GDPR. For that reason, I'm also working as a trainer on lots of these parts. I got into GDPR also for certification like CIPP and certified DPO at PECB. That's also one of the reasons that it's quite interesting to see how GDPR is evolving. That's exactly what we want to cover for today. During this session, I first of all would like to get a bit of an overview how GDPR is doing and how the market is doing actually with GDPR today. What I noticed in lots of my interactions with customers and people working on GDPR is that they regularly refer to the year 2000 problem on that one, and lots of people are comparing it to it. Let me get a bit into that one, and yeah, considering GDPR as a hype is one of the things I see regularly happening on customers. What I would like to do actually is look at GDPR from a bit of a different perspective, and lots of customers are working on GDPR and try to see what the core value is of GDPR, and that's what I will try to extract from the marketing stuff which we see on a daily basis. Additionally, why do we see the effect of GDPR? Why do have so many companies difficulties to implement it? And I will cover that topic also in the next part of the presentation. My point here is that we actually should move into more a GDP mindset, where GDP stands for General Data Protection. Some people with some economic background will certainly with English will understand GDP differently, but we will focus on data protection. Getting it implemented is not only one thing, but we will see for the future, as privacy is getting a sort of economic value right now, is that we will need to make it sustainable, that actually you should taking care of it as getting GDP and data protection in your company's core business as such. At the end, I will provide you with some additional takeaways. There has been some news also lately, last week and even yesterday, by ENISA, the IT department of the European Union. I will cover a few of these slides, and you will get them, of course, in the slide deck later on slide share. Okay, let's get started. What's the status of GDPR today, or the implementation of GDPR today? It's in most cases quite difficult to get some updated numbers on that one. Is that there is no measurement as such, and we see that we are highly depending on surveys that are being conducted by a few companies who have usually a sort of marketing interest in GDPR. One of the most recent I found actually quite lately is still being sourced from June 2017, so almost 6 months ago, but in discussions and articles we see currently is that the status has not really changed. So if you look at the numbers, what is very amazing that we see that more than 50% of companies in these surveys mentioned that they are not ready at all. 60% absolutely not ready, even not having a plan or no actions taken at all. If we also take the companies into account that are started with it but not really close, we see even that we end up to 75 to 80% of companies that are still struggling to get anywhere close to GDPR readiness. And if we take it from a different view, is to be really ready for GDPR, only 4% of companies and enterprises can answer yes, which is pretty disturbing as such. And what we see, one of the major reasons for that one is, for example, that the absence of GDPR certification. And that one is making clear that people or companies are not driving GDPR fast enough, right? Another reason for getting not ready for GDPR is also that actually the start of GDPR and how it got announced is quite different. And still up till now, we see that the marketing and the focus on the publications is pretty negative, meaning we started actually in 2016, more or less. I will come back to some time frames later on in the presentation. The focus initially was pretty much on the fines, and you probably remember, and it still is there in GDPR, of course, that the fines were managing the 10 million euros up to 2% or even 4%, 20 million in cases of breaches. Second thing, what we also mentioned and what we see in the marketing stuff is the direct marketing. As you see, with direct marketing, GDPR is explicitly mentioned that for the reason of the spamming and so on, people will not be able anymore to spam you as such without your consent, and that's a very busy market as such, and will get directly hit by the GDPR implementation. So people start worrying on that one. What we see right now, almost 6 months before the start of GDPR officially, at least, we get more and more boosted with tools and to get it fixed, and that's one of the basics where we see that the comparison with the year 2000 tooling is coming up. And one other thing, certainly because lots of these marketing campaigns are driven by tools, is the scariness of GDPR is mainly on the focus, and that's something that I would like to turn around. And PECB recently also featured a blog where GDPR is actually pushed as an opportunity, and that's exactly where I want to look at on that one. So it's pretty unique, and we see luckily that more and more organizations are pushing the positive side of GDPR. As I mentioned, 25th of May 2018, and that's exactly also where the presentation slide deck is referring to. As 26th of May, the day after, are we ready? Are you going for it? Of course, the marketing campaigns are putting the pressure more and more on that one to get ready on that one. And that is causing for lots of companies actually sort of GDPR fatigue. Getting overloaded with GDPR information if you're not started ready yet. You get more and more persistent feedback that you should get started, should get ready, and while a lot of companies are panicking for that one, right? So as I mentioned, how are companies looking at it? I mentioned already is that lots of these CIOs, CAOs, and CISOs are referring to year 2000 on GDPR. Lots of people in this area of working already were there and working on IT already for quite a while when the year 2000 problem or the year 2000 bug popped up. And I see in lots of communications with experienced people and even in legal popping up this question. So what is it? Can we compare year 2000 with GDPR as such? Let's put a few things on the list and compare year 2000 with GDPR. Of course, there are some similarities, and explicitly, as I mentioned in the previous slides, is that the last-minute response to the deadline. We knew in the year 2000 that quite some programs which were designed before year 2000 were going to break or supposed to break in many cases. So that response to a deadline to get it fixed very, very quickly is pretty much the same what we see in GDPR and year 2K. What we also see in the marketing campaigns is lots of tech companies are focusing on delivering the right tools for year 2K or GDPR with magic solutions in most of the cases that say, well, we can fix your GDPR problems right now with the right tooling, right? That was exactly the same for the year 2000 bug as such, but still I will point out some differences in the next part of it. But still, the design, how GDPR is approached, the design, how year 2K was approached is pretty much the same. And we will see that GDPR will focus on a few things like privacy by design or more general security by design. It relies heavily on secure development life cycles, which is exactly the same things also we mentioned in the designs of the platforms which were impacted by year 2K, right? So lots of similarities between the two, so it makes sense on comparing it as a hype or as exactly the same thing in the approaches. But still, what I want to point out here is that year 2K versus GDPR has some distinct differences. One of the major things, of course, is that the year 2000 bug was actually based on a technology issue, meaning that not being able to handle the 4 digits, switching from the 99 to 2000, switching back from the 99 to 00 in some cases. This is not the case for GDPR. While GDPR actually is a law or a legal issue, it was not the case for the year 2K. So that's exactly for my point I'm making here in number 2, is that GDPR is a law being established by the European Union. It has taken quite a while to get there. I will show you some time frames in the next few slides. Year 2K, as of 1st of January 2000, actually, it was passed, and of course we had some issues, but that is not the case for GDPR. So the GDPR is there to stay, right? And that is exactly also one of the things I want to point out. The differences between them is that year 2K as a technical problem was fixed and was passed on. GDPR is not, and also one of the important things I will lay out in this presentation today is that GDPR has some fundamental changes in principles, right? So it lays out some strong push on changes of mentality, and that's exactly the foundation of the presentation of today. One of the things that, considering a GDPR as a hub, is pretty dangerous as such is that if you consider GDPR, many companies just implemented the GDPR stuff just to comply with GDPR. One of the pretty important things in that one is that just implementing GDPR is not protecting you as such. You can be compliant on the 25th of May, but it doesn't stop. One of the major reasons of that one is, as IT and in general, data protection is a moving target. The data that you are managing in your company and other companies is not at a standstill. Data is moving, so that means that your data protection approach to your data is a moving target. So even if you're compliant the 25th of May, it's very likely that you will not even be compliant anymore at the end of the year if you do not change the protection of your systems. The effort that we're doing right now is mainly focusing on getting compliant, changing the existing things, historical implementations of your systems, but to keep compliant, you will very likely need a different approach. More fundamental, you need to change the way that you protect your systems and your people, and that's exactly what I will try to cover today in the presentation. One other thing is also being based a bit on the E2K approach, is that if you were not fixing your E2K issues, then one of your platforms of some technical platforms will not be working, but that's not the approach that, that GDPR has taken. If you're not compliant, essentially, because GDPR is a law, not compliant actually means that you're violating the law, and that has some serious consequences, as I mentioned already. Being not compliant, first of all, you're violating a law. You know what happens with the fines we were mentioning before. But also, GDPR is providing quite some power to your end users, if not customers. These customers get a pretty powerful feedback option, or power option actually, in the GDPR, and for example, the subject data access requests will require you to respond to that one in a very time constrained way of doing it. So that means that quite some processes, not only on protection level, need to be changed, right? Looking at the GDPR as such, there are some other things you should keep in mind. Although it's a law, it's not necessarily the best practice. And I will give you some examples later on. As you know, what's the behavior of a law? It's usually taking some time to establish the law. As you know, that actually the GDPR is there officially, at least since 2016. There has been some time before actually it got established. And some of the rules in GDPR actually is from the data protection practices we got already for quite a while ago. It's not the best practice. Plus, as I mentioned, a law very typically is a sort of consensus, certainly within the European environment. Plus, it's usually behind reality. And one of the things, for example, we will see that it's not always based on the up-to-date techniques, although the GDPR will provide some mentions to state-of-the-art technology. So as such, GDPR is pretty unique, that is looking forward to have the best data protection measures in place. Still, protection, as mentioned, is the minimum of the minimum, actually, and it's the minimum to be compliant. So you can do better. That's why also that the rule number 1 is there. It's not necessarily best practice to implement it. One of the key features on GDPR actually is that GDPR is focusing on personal people's data, living people, right? Physical people as such. So there are some constraints in when GDPR is not compliant, and one of the things, for example, explicitly is GDPR is mentioning that it's not applying to company data, meaning legal persons or anything else that actually is related to company processes. Officially, GDPR is not focusing on this data, but as you probably can imagine, that lots of processes do involve people, like communication data, contact persons, and so on. So GDPR is very much around the corner, and looking at your processes, you will probably hit GDPR anyway. One of the things that also makes people be a bit of scared for implementing GDPR is pretty amazing that we don't see a lot of successful reference cases. In my own list of customers, I only know a few of large companies that are working on GDPR since 2 years now, who have actually successfully implemented GDPR. But if you look at that volume, that actually is very scary. And we will still need to see a boost in successful implementations, and by preferences, the more we get of these and successful references by the companies that are implementing it would help a lot to make people more confident on implementing GDPR the right way. One of the other things, and this is a bit of a more legal issue as such, is that there is actually no certification, at least no company certification for GDPR. As you all know, probably as a person, as a DPO, there are some technical certification, but still these are not validated from a legal perspective. There are some ISO-based companies, including PECB, of course, that do offer certified DPOs, but that is not applicable to companies as such. So right now, there's no way as a company to prove or to certify for GDPR readiness. And that's one of the things we would expect actually in a very short term to change. And I've got some news on that one actually since yesterday or 2 days ago. For example, ENISA has published some reports and some suggestions on GDPR readiness and certification, but that it's still not being adopted by the EU or the EU organizations as such. So I'm very much curious what will happen in the next 6 months. Although that we will see that many of these certifications can only apply as of the 25th of May. So we will see some things change, but as the GDPR is applicable as the 25th of May, and lots of these certifications can only apply on the 25th of May. So yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg solution here, but just be on the watch of that one. And I would highly suggest, as if you're prepping for a GDPR readiness, that you also have a close look on the certification of that one. I will come back to that one later on, because one of the approaches will be ISO 27001, and that's exactly what I would like to explain in this session for today. Right. One of the other things that is pretty amazing is that although that GDPR has announced in 2016, it does exist already quite longer, meaning that I will show you in a few slides that the first notes and the legal text are already existing for 2 years earlier. But why is GDPR not implemented earlier on? Why are communities and more specifically enterprises and companies are only getting ready now? One of the different things we see, and I will easily make in the next slide the comparison with aviation, is that in IT security or data protection, people do not get killed or instantly, meaning, and that's a big thing, is the impact of not securing your company is not as direct as what we see, for example, in aviation. The difference between responsibility and accountability always has been a bit of a bizarre discussion as such, and GDPR is making it very clear now that there's a very strict definition for accountability right now, meaning that GDPR is taking accountability as the people, or the one people in this case, mostly the responsible of your company, will get to court. So that's what accountability is. Still, except for a few cases in the Netherlands and in Germany, in Europe at least, we haven't seen many cases, and again, the applicability of GDPR will be of the 25th of May in next year. Why did we see some court cases in the Netherlands and certainly in Germany? Is because the Netherlands and Germany have adopted actually the GDPR already in their national law. And they have used it already for last year, for example, to drag some companies who were not respecting the law into court with some pretty similar cases and fines we have seen there. Other thing, what we see is that GDPR does offer some extended power to subjects, and again, it's only applicable of the 25th of May. So we see a lot of people that are getting into conflict with the law, or companies at least, can only start to go to court or the Privacy Commission, for example, as of the 25th of May. Most of the European companies do have some similar laws, but they are not the same extent in many cases as GDPR allows to, or in many cases the way to get to court is very extensive, very time consuming most of the cases, and there will be a shortcut as such for GDPR. I'm pretty curious by the 25th of May if we will get some American way of doing it, meaning that some lawsuits that will get into court very easy. I don't know, but that's exactly what lots of companies are looking at very closely on that one, right? I already mentioned aviation as such, and there is a very distinct way that aviation takes security versus IT security as such. And what you will see, for example, I mentioned already, is that in aviation, airports and flight companies must take security very seriously. By default, their flights and aviation is taking secure by default and secure by design. Do you remember, if you go into a flight, that you get these notices that you should shut down, or at least lock down your phone for communication, mobile communications? If you remember, for example, the guidelines on aviations is even providing services until the level of nuts and bolts, maintenance guides of planes, or describing exactly which bolt and which nut and which component should be placed or replaced in planes. We don't have that kind of security in IT security as such, and being honest on that one, that's what we need. We see some guidelines popping up. I will refer to some additional guidelines, and we need to fundamentally change that approach in IT security and getting a bit more closer into aviation, for example. One other thing I also mentioned here is that the regulation in aviation is keeping up to date with reality. They are very much experience-based, and the least thing that pops up that is a violation or causing trouble in aviation is actually being taken seriously, and most of the cases the regulations are adopted very quickly. Remember the issues we had with some exploding telephones? It was quite easily adapted in much of the regulations, or actually the guidelines on flying, right? And that's actually also one of the things, is the regulations and the rules that are applied in aviation are pretty much up to speed with current threats. Even technical as such, and that's not the case in the IT security basics. If there is any law already, which is GDPR, one of the only ones, we're still behind on approaching this setup and getting into serious business right now, right? So one of the things, and that's very much the way I'd like to take to my customers also, and we all should do so, is if we strip the hype factor of GDPR, what is left, right? What's the new stuff, what we see in GDPR? And that's in the next thing I would like to take with you, is what's the essential difference with GDPR versus IT security in general, right? I still would like to challenge you. Did you already take some time to read the GDPR? Most of my IT colleagues I talked to did not. And what I would like to challenge you is take some time, and if you're a quick reader, it takes an evening to read, so 88 pages as such. It's quite challenging also, although if you get through it, you will see there is quite some interesting stuff into it. Of course, there's some legal stuff in there, but let me provide you with a quick run through and highlight a few interesting things. Of course, based on the general approach on this year, this is not, of course, a full thread and a full discussion of GDPR. I can't cover this in 45 minutes as we have right now. And what you will see with PCB and some other courses, they usually take 2 to 4 days, depending on what components you would like to get trained on. Very quick. There are two distinct sections in the GDPR regulations, and the first part is what you will see is we have some recitals. We have 173 recitals that are actually introducing a GDPR regulation. The recitals are actually the base existence reasons why do we need GDPR, and it's mainly based on also some laws and even some worldwide regulations, essentially, which actually lead to 99 articles, which actually are the law and what should be considered as a law as such. Please keep in mind that to implement GDPR, we also have some directives which I will not cover in this session, but please keep in mind that GDPR is accompanied by some guidelines and regulations, directives to be called as such, which indicate how GDPR is to be implemented. One important thing, as I mentioned already, GDPR is focusing on EU people and operations by EU-based companies and offices as such, meaning that one of the typical questions you will get is that if you are an international organization, does it apply? Yes, it does. As soon as you are treating EU people data or you have an office in the EU, you must comply to GDPR. Let me turn the other way around. Do you need to apply GDPR if you're not an EU-based company and you're not treating data from EU? No. In that case, you're excluded from the GDPR. But again, as soon as you get some data from the EU customers, or even EU prospects as such, GDPR does apply, right? I already mentioned a bit of the time frame on GDPR, and it's pretty interesting to see that already in '95, before the millennium changed, we had already a directive which actually was covering privacy regulations as such, but the only change here, the difference here, is that GDPR is a law. And that means that the EU states do not have to adapt their law system nationally to apply GDPR, and that's a different approach for the directives. In general, a directive is a guideline, and in many cases, a directive needs to be translated into national law, needs to be adopted in the national law before it can apply, which is not the case for GDPR. The European Data Protection Supervisor already published some initial texts already in 2011, and we had some adoptions in 2012 by the European Commission to strengthen online privacy rights and digital economy. And there's a change coming up also on the directives on that one. But the first adoption of GDPR already is stated in 2014, where the European Parliament actually adopted the GDPR, and the final adoption, or the regulation, went into force in 2016. And that's very important to see here, is that the official publication on that one is in May 2016, which automatically makes GDPR run into force 2 years later, which is exactly the 25th of May. Right, and that's what most of the companies will focus on, and it's a bit of a pity as such that we did not see any move earlier than 2016 on that one. This one, because actually we could have seen it coming, and for the reasons I mentioned earlier, this did not happen, and so people are focusing very much on the 25th of May 2018 to get it running, but they lost quite some time on implementing GDPR, right? What is new on GDPR as such is that it's not the old-fashioned way of implementing a law, and there are quite some novelties actually in GDPR because of the principles that are explained in GDPR. First of all, is privacy by design and by default, which means that you need to develop your technical systems and approaches with the intention of having privacy by design, and it should be implemented into production with privacy by default. So it should be locked down, or any system that you would implement that is treating any privacy data should be secure by default. Also, one of the specific terms you will see in the legal texts of GDPR is it requires state-of-the-art techniques, which is actually demanding that you should implement the best practice. All the law itself took some time. Additionally, that's where it, most of the cases goes wrong with the implementations, is that you will also see that GDPR in some different terms is referring to the people, the process and technology, and so it says explicitly that also the process that you are implementing to treat the privacy data should be compliant to GDPR. And in many articles, you will see that also GDPR is demanding that the people, the company, and more specifically, for example, your DPO should be ready for data protection. There are many new techniques or principles also being covered by GDPR, but I highlighted the most important one is that the data should be collected and treated with purpose and data limitations. You can only use and collect data if there is an existence for it and a reason for it. Of course, there's more about it, but I can't cover all the technical details or the stuff that is covered by GDPR in this session. That's why I wanted to quickly run to you to the links, and you can quickly find the references later on after the sessions and investigate yourself. In essence, we have 11 chapters and 99 articles, which are already mentioned before, and there are some novelties into that one, is that how that companies are looked in. What I would like to highlight here is that the principles are covered in chapter 2. You see articles 5 to 11, which actually highlight, for example, transparency and the rights of the subjects, which is actually chapter 3. Going for article 12 to 23 as such. So this is pretty interesting to see what principles that GDPR is pushing forward and actually will validate later on as soon as it gets into action. Right. Lots of more stuff to do. I will not cover it into details. Also, for example, liabilities, you know exactly what is referring to is to the fines and how you could get into court as a company treating personal data as such, right? If we dive a bit more into details, Article 5 and 6 will cover the lawfulness of processing and how you should treat that personal data, and this is usually what the technical vendors will be referring to. So it's pretty interesting to see what principles you should respect on how and when you can actually contain data or actually acquire data for processing as such. Keep in mind also, for example, what I will refer to later on is how direct marketing is related to this. For example, getting the approval for processing data is covered in this one. Very specific, what Article 5 is covering. This is one of the focuses, I think, also on the protection of your data, is the lawfulness, when and what can you do with the data, fairness, how you should treat the data, and transparency is how you should explain why you're handling the data and how you should behave in relation to the subject, so the person you're treating. Data purpose limitation, data minimization. So GDPR is explicitly limiting data you can have and how accurate data should be, and more specifically accountability, and that is directly related to the responsibility accountability that will get actually counted into GDPR as such. Also, one of the things specifically for the IT guys and girls here is that be careful that the purpose limitation very explicitly also mentions is that you can only treat data for the initial purpose on that one, which actually means that for lots of companies you can't simply transport your data into a development environment. Be careful with it. Some specific articles on the communications to the data subjects, so the people that are of which you are treating the data. And for example, Article 15 is a very impressive one, because actually the data subject will get a very much powerful access to your data. As soon as you request for data, there are some very specific rules on how a person can get access to the data, and you should comply to it. There are even very specific dates and how much time you get to respond to these requests. It's very high level view on this one here. It's very specifically mentioned. There are lots of information on this one, but my point here is that we should keep in mind on that one, right? And explicitly Article 25 is mentioning that you should provide data protection by design and by default. My point here is this is actually one of the core articles here, but what you should keep in mind that implementing this as a principle will require to do so some difficult options to get it done. Why is it so difficult to implement data protection in specific situations? What you will see that if you're talking about data protection as such, we have multiple parties in the game here. If you're looking at a company, you have management that will have a view on GDPR. They will be accountable for handling the data, and they will immediately ask, for example, to the legal department to get compliant as such. And one of the things you will see in the TPO function, for example, very typically the TPO needs both legal and IT experiences to get it right. And so the legal will poke the DPO and to get some things running, to data protection and so on. So we will need a project to start off with data protection. Very quickly, if you talk about the IT protection, the legal will push, or the departments will very much push the actions to the IT department, but as usual, IT department needs a budget, needs some guidance on projects and so on. And to have that up and running, to protect your data, you need understanding of the business. So not only legal, not only IT, but also business has a very much an important part of the story. In between, we have some project management. These guys needs to run the project now by the 25th of May, so the time is shortening very quickly. But usually they don't have an understanding on legal, IT, or business, so that's the fourth party in the game. Additionally, as I mentioned, also outside a bit of the story, here is the customer with the prospects or the subjects as such, which have a specific rights, which also mean that you need to take into account the communication to these customers as such. Is a pretty important part of GDPR, right? Few things here is how would you like to get it implemented? Very interesting view is here. Do you want to have it retroactively? Are you going to fix the existing environment, or the other approach is well, we will implement it for the new platforms, but what about then the existing platforms and so on? So this is a pretty much a discussion which we'll see while implementing GDPR in many companies, right? The good news here, and that's the key story of today, is that you shouldn't ask that question because actually ISO 27001, which is an ISO standard as such for IT security best practices, is actually covering the entire process. And what you will see, and the ISO 27000 platform, security.com platform, has done the exercise already. You could essentially map GDPR entirely to ISO 27001. Very quick overview. If you're mapping the GDPR requirements, you will see the ISO 27000 mapping on that one, and also including the components, awareness, and communications. And that's exactly where I want to close out the presentation of today, is that if you see that the implementations of 27001 will include asset management, for example, including classification, for example, for data privacy. Implementing access controls to protect your data is already included in the best practice of 27001. Just a point here that the actual implementations for the ISO standard are covered by the ISO 27002. So 27001 is the formal standard which is being used for auditing and checking off the items. 27002 is a practical implementation of the ISO standard. Right. Also for suppliers, thinking of cloud solutions here with GDPR is very much important, and also incident management in case of you need to respond, for example, to issues and data breaches more specifically. In GDPR is covered by the incident management in the ISO standard. Very important to know also is that the ISO standard overall implements a 4-step phase, which is the plan, do, check, act, PDCA cycle as such. And if you start implementing it, you could start with a very small scope for that one. For example, data protection, GDPR, and the ISO standard will guarantee that actually you start improving your quality of your IT security and start improving in every next step. And that's why the standard sort of a quality assurance model will apply here. And that's exactly what also is mentioned in this one. It's a very well-known approach to that one, and is unified in lots of practical implementations. Right. Just to close out on the presentation for today, what I would like to mention here is that just implementing GDPR is not sufficient, and what I would like to get you convinced of is you should think of GDP as a general mentality. And the good news is that in many presentations, and for example this one of Brad Smith at Gartner conference is already mentioning GDP as a general data protection mentality, and that is what we need, because GDPR is there to stay, and in the next years we will need to build in data protection in the core of our systems. Right. That's why I would like to convince my customers to not only go for GDPR, but actually take the foundation of GDPR into the design of the systems. And therefore, as ISO also implements it, we should go for security by design. Right. An additional thing with GDPR is that data protection concerns every single person in your company. So not only legal, not only IT, but every single person should get on board, including your customers. And you can consider GDP as an ecosystem as such, right? And you will recognize this slide as such that we will need to hang on everyone in the same material, in the same approach on this one, right? How do we get there? One of the things is a security ABC to get everyone on board, and ABC stands for awareness, behavior, and culture. Awareness makes sure that everyone is aware why security is needed, why we should get it into the foundation of the company, and what we actually would like to get is to people change behavior. And as anyone knows, changing behavior will take some time, and the fundamental issue here is that we should get it into the culture of the company, right? And that will require some training, communication. So the soft skill part of GDP is very important, not only implementing technology as a platform, right? A few key points here to close out the presentation as such. A few things on communications. Make sure you communicate correctly to your internal people, employees, also to your customer, and keeping silent, and usually for example in data breaches is usually not the good way to do so. And also one of the other things in implementing security is you need to make it a positive story. That's exactly what I would like to explain here. Negation, so saying you can't do anything or you should not do this and this, is very important to take the positive story as here. And as you probably know, as for students also, is the attention span of your customers and your people is usually very short. So make it very short communication, very to the point communications, and more important, repeat the story. And that's why the investment in security will be a long-lasting effort that we need to take, right? So getting ABC implemented in security will also require that your company change and that you build a sort of security reputation on that one, and that's one of the difficult things to build in. So keep GDPR as the start of actually changing your company in a GDP way of doing, right? Good. That's more or less the story here. Build GDP as such, and I wanted to provide you with some conclusions right here. Is get confident with GDPR yourself is the start of the story. And the good news here, as I mentioned, is that ISO exactly builds into this standard, and that's exactly what we will get at. I just added today a bit of a slide here because ENISA published a report on getting certified as a company and some guidelines on that one. Have a read of it. It's very interesting to see that actually the mentality also on that one is changing.
Thank you, Peter, for providing such an insightful presentation regarding this new regulation. It was a pleasure to have you as our presenter. In addition, I want to inform all the attendees that PCV provides training and certification services for General Data Protection Regulation, Introduction, Foundation, and Certified Data Protection Officer. Now we will go ahead and take some time for Q&A session. The first question is, having seen the GDPR current status you have shared with us, do you think that there could be a chance that GDPR go live date is postponed?
GDPR as such is a law. It has been set as a decision by the European Commission. Will the date change? From a law perspective, no. The only reaction that we can expect is that maybe the application itself will cut some slack as such, but also, as we mentioned, is that it's a law and it highly depends on how you react actually to your customers and the people that you're treating data of. And that's also one of the things I want to mention, is that even if your data protection or your company is not ready, one of the key points here is just be mature in how we respond to these customers. And if they get angry or if they have an issue, make sure that you make the touch with your customers, make sure that you respond to them. The problem here is that frustrated companies or customers that cannot get in touch with you, their natural response is to get to the DPA, so the Data Protection Authority, or even worse, they will get into touch with the European Data Protection Authority, and then you will get a sort of legal approach in here, which is usually very time consuming and very reputation damage. So even if you're not getting ready by the 25th of May, make sure that you can communicate with your customers to control the damage. Okay.
Thank you, Peter, for your answer. The next question is, what are the fines for a company that does not comply with this law in the established time?
That's also one of the confusing histories here in GDPR, and essentially the two numbers you hear is the 10 million euros or the 2% or the 20 million euros or the 4%. First of all, these two categories will fine you with the maximum amount. So if first the percentage is the global turnover, so not the the single company, but the group company as such, and they will fine you with the maximum number of both of them, so the 20 million or the 4%, which one is the bigger one. What's the difference between the 10 million and 20 million? The highest fines are if you're violating the major principles and the core principles of GDPR. So if you're not implementing GDPR and you do nothing about security or data protection, you will be very likely fined for the highest quote. If you do implement, or you do at least the best effort for implementing GDPR, they could fine you for the 10 million, but that is even worst case, meaning that if you would even end up in court, first of all, it's a legal process, it will take time. But if you can prove that you have done the best effort possible, and that's also one of the key components in GDPR, it's saying that you should do whatever is possible. So the best effort is a very important component in GDPR. You could end up in 10 million, but if you can prove that is outside your control, the 10 million even does not apply. So don't worry too much about it if you can prove that you do efforts to get there. That's an important signal also to core that that they will probably lower the fines or make it more relevant or at least more actionable as such, right?
Thank you, Peter. The next question is, will GDPR cover UK after Brexit?
It's a very good question, meaning that officially the UK will, at least officially speaking, outside of the European law, but we will get into the same situation as we see right now, for example, with Canada or the US. So very likely there will be a protocol and there will be a agreement between UK and how they should apply the European data protection, because if they are still handling EU data, they should be applying the law, and there will be an agreement as such. If not, it will be considered as an external third party considering data, and they should have a specific agreement with the customer or the person that of which the data is treated. But I don't think actually we will go that way. It's very likely that we will get a sort of data protection agreement like we have with Canada and the US, for example, to do so, right?
Thank you. The following question is, how can you inject privacy by design for a tool or a platform created for an enterprise?
That's a good question, and I also had on one of the PCB and discussion privacy forums is the same question: is a technology data protection proof, or how can you certify a certain technology? The issue here is that you should actually, from the developer or the provider, should have a certificate that actually they are following the SDLC, so the Secure Development Lifecycle approach on this one. And to be honest, I think that majority of the programs that are alive right now only partially have been developed using that lifecycle. That puts two problems in place right here. Is the software compliant, and has it been implemented secure, yes or no? You can have a safe software, but if you don't put your practices in practice, or actually you put the secure development lifecycle configuration in practice, it still is not secure. So yes, absolutely, lots of companies have not developed yet their software in a safe manner, and we will use this push of GDPR to get there. But please keep in mind that the lifecycle, secure development lifecycle, already is known for 20 years, and there has not been any push to do so. The fines and everything else within GDPR will, I think, push to be more secure, but we're not there yet, and we will not be there by the 25th of May. So that's one of the major risks we'll see on data breaches in the 25th of May.
Thank you. The next question is, do you expect more explicit checklist audit guides similar to PSI for GDPR?
Yes, absolutely. Meaning that it's still in development, and we see, and that's why also I mentioned the report that ENISA is providing. There's no clear guidance right now, although that the WP29 group is continuing to deliver some guides and practical guides on this one. Yes, this is exactly touching the fact that we don't have any certification yet for GDPR, but we will have similar situations, and the problem here, as I mentioned before, is we will have a sort of check and act solution here, is that GDPR will be only applied the 25th of May, and will we get some guidance? Yes, absolutely, but that's one of the areas where we see the actions by the European Union moving very, very fast, and they have no official instance yet who can do certification. But I think, and that's a personal opinion here, that lots of organizations that are recognized internationally, like ISO organizations, ISO partners like PCB, will be mandated to do that audit or certification as such.
Thank you, Peter. Please be informed that due to the time limitation, we will read only one more question, and other questions will be addressed individually by email by Peter. The last question is, GDPR does not demand any certification, so how to prove that you comply with the regulation?
Yeah, that's a fully follow-up. Actually, hang on that one. A couple of the previous question as such. Right now, the GDPR does not demand for certification, but actually the certification and the code of best practices is fully baked in GDPR. We're just not ready there to do so. How can you comply to GDPR? That's exactly where INISTA provided a report on. Is you can use the ISO principles and, for example, do a sort of small ISO implementation project, meaning the ISO 27001 does provide this, and also the ISO 27000 can be implemented in small pieces. So I would highly suggest here is to implement the ISO 27001 implementation focused on data protection, focused on GDPR, and then you can do, for example, an internal and an external audit. And these frameworks do exist. There are companies and partners that can do ISO certification, so you could go for the ISO route and implement a very small ISO project on GDPR and get certified on that one. And in this case, you can then have a sort of small first certification by the organization, which proves that you implement the right practices to do so. So there's a route for this one already. Okay.
Thank you, Peter, once again for this great presentation, and I also want to thank all the attendees for joining us today. I want to inform you that this webinar is recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey, and we would really appreciate it if you could complete it and provide us with your feedback. Thank you all, and I hope to see you on our upcoming webinars.